Okay, so got your bio, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So then I'm not reading the one that we...
Yes, sounds good.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, welcome to Humanities in Session. Today's session is a seminar by CHR visiting scholar Muhannad Ayyash. Sorry, that's okay. Muhannad is visiting the CHR on his sabbatical from mid-February to mid-April. So we've had the special privilege of being able to interact with Muhannad and engage with his work while he's been in residence. We haven't yet engaged with his scholarship. I should add that Muhannad has been an unbelievably active interlocutor, given that it's given the unfolding genocide, and that's a question, a term I'd like to hark and return to in our conversation. But given the unfolding genocide, Muhannad has very graciously and generously been giving radio interviews, doing public talks, a number of public talks, panel discussions, and I understand also talk in a mosque to 4,000 tomorrow, 4,000 people in person and 5,000 online, which I understand is the biggest audience you've addressed knowingly, although you have a big presence on Canadian public in Canadian media in the last while. So we don't know how many people you're addressing through those forums, but I just want to mark the incredible kind of generosity and commitment of Muhannad during this time and during the time of his residency. So Muhannad is Professor of Sociology at Mount Royal University, born as a son of Silwan, instead of a son of soil, a son of Silwan. Silwan is a very special neighborhood in Jerusalem, and with his family immigrated to Canada as a teenager. Muhannad has published his first monograph in 2019, The Hermeneutics of Violence, and has currently completed a second book, manuscript. The chapter that was circulated for those that requested the paper is a chapter from Muhannad's second book, and that will be that will form the substance of today's seminar and discussion. And of course, Muhannad is also he's a board member of Al-Shabaka Policy Network, which is a very important organization, a Palestinian organization that puts out analysis, mainly policy analyses, but in the last couple of years have developed into a really substantive intellectual analyses, and I would encourage people who are interested in the debates on the current debates on de-Zionization, decolonization, national liberation, and particularly how all these three programs, concepts, ideas, commitments might be thought. And these are particularly important questions for anyone outside of the region or for anyone who's not immediately implicated, but is interested, committed, and wishes to be in solidarity. As an academic, Muhannad has published widely in a range of journals, such as the European Journal of International Relations, a journal known to many of us here, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as Critical Sociology, and is a regular contributor to Al Jazeera, to the Baffler, Middle East Eye, Mondovice, The Breach, and Middle East Monitor. And for those who follow developments in Palestine, Israel, and the region, all of these are really important online platforms to follow. And just while Muhannad has been here, I read an article that was published in Al Jazeera on the same day or the same time as I was watching Al Jazeera, and all of a sudden Muhannad popped up with his the Sea Point apartment in the background.
Greenpoint.
Greenpoint in the background to do an interview on Al Jazeera. So very much a public intellectual, but today we have the great gift and privilege of engaging with Muhannad as a scholar and as an academic as well. So because Muhannad has this incredible facility as a public intellectual to move from the theoretical, the conceptual, the kind of more technical questions of a scholarly nature into a more general, open and generalist discourse, please feel free to make comments, not just ask questions. Please feel free after Muhannad has presented the chapter to engage as you would in any space. So, Muhannad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for that far too kind of an introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming here today and making time here today. For those joining online, I'm really humbled and appreciative of all Heidi's efforts here. Made me feel at home, like many of you have and many other people in this town have done since I've been here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here. Obviously, when I started to think about coming here, the ongoing genocide had not started. The South African case to the International Court of Justice charging Israel with genocide had not begun, but all the more reason that I wanted to be here, to be frank, and away from a place like Canada during this time. Where, a slight correction, I am not featured on Canadian media.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Because they don't want what I say on air. And that's okay. I have my other platforms, TRT, Al Jazeera, TV stations in Pakistan, local radio stations here, alternative media in Canada, and even a couple of community radio stations in the US that I've spoken to. And I'm happy to continue to do that and challenge mainstream media and institutions in Canada in general. Whether it be universities, media institutions, political institutions that are determined to censor the Palestinian experience and to erase the Palestinian experience, and thereby participate in the erasure of Palestinians from history and politics. They are part and parcel of the Israeli settler colonial project, these institutions. And I have no problem calling them out on that and continuing to challenge them regardless of what they try to do to me. This paper, I'm just going to pull up my phone just to kind of keep an idea of time here so that I don't go over. I'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes or so, just kind of giving the overview of the paper that some of you may have had a chance to read, while others maybe just glanced over or hadn't had a chance to look at it all. So I'll try to speak to everyone, wherever you are on that. Like Heidi said, I'd like this to be very much an open discussion. You don't have to ask me questions afterwards if there's something that I said registers with something you're working on. I'd like to hear about it. So we can just have it as a kind of a open seminar type of discussion over this material. I guess one of the reasons why I chose this particular chapter to focus on today is because of where I am and the focus on arts in this center and the humanities in this center as well. You know, I often have to start with the question in most settings in which I speak of, why even bring up literature at all when you're talking about settler colonial sovereignty and politics and the way that I discuss the Palestinian struggle. I guess I don't need that as much here. But I'll still say a couple of things about why focus on literature. And to me, the importance of literature is that it gives you an ability to see things differently from the dominant grammar and logics of colonial modernity. Literature has an ability to open up alternative avenues of seeing and conceptualizing and speaking about a decolonial alternative that theory, philosophy, social sciences don't necessarily have. It has an easier way of doing it, and does it with more depth, I find, than the social sciences or the humanities, for that matter. I think it plays a really critical role in that it you know, as Fanon theorized many decades ago, that the role of the intellectual and the cultural producers, you know, I hate that term, but you know what I mean, novelists, poets, in the national liberation struggle, is to do a couple of things. One, keep the people going, contextualize for them the nature of their struggle, and give them an idea of what that future liberation at least kind of might feel like or look like. So literature can do an amazing job in providing that kind of guidance for people on the path to liberation. In terms of Palestinian literature, it has always played that role. It has always played the role of galvanizing the people, giving them, like I said, direction, giving them purpose, speaking to them on a level that they understand in a visceral way, in an emotional way, because all of these things are critical in the struggle for liberation. And of course, Palestinian literature is quite complex, it's quite vast, it's quite a large field, but the main reason I focus on two books in this chapter, Mahmoud Darwish's In the Absence of Presence, or Absent Presence, and Ayyash, who's not Palestinian, he's Lebanese, Gate of the Sun, is that those two texts I find really do speak to that decolonial alternative in ways that are quite deep, that are quite informative, that are quite illuminatory of what it is that is at stake here in Palestinian decolonial liberation. What does a full decolonial liberation, meaning the creation of an alternative world to colonial modernity, means and looks like? Now that's a gargantuan task, and of course we can't put it all on Darwish and Houri, but they do, I think in those two texts especially, they do provide some key insights that we can then build on as scholars and as activists in this very difficult struggle. I think one of the more interesting things that is happening in these two texts in particular is a particular way of challenging our understanding of space and time and the relation between self and other. And those two are always connected for me. Whenever you start to reimagine space and time outside of the space and time of colonial modernity, you know, more or less bounded space and linear time, progressive time, you start to really question, what does it mean to be a self? What does it mean to relate to others? And vice versa. You know, those two questions are always interconnected. And these two books really do quite an amazing job, I think, of challenging colonial, modernist, and postmodernist. Let's not forget that postmodernity is also colonial. Versions of space and time. One of the key features of the writing that happens in those books is how they grapple with the question of erasure. the erasure of Palestine, and then the erasure of the author, which is the erasure of the quote-unquote I, our understanding of the I. And unlike, sort of postmodern critiques of modernist literature where they say the death of the author is associated with the centrality of the text, right? Like, so the author disappears because the text becomes more central. I don't find that interesting, sorry. I think much more interesting that happens in these texts, in their decolonial trajectory, not a postmodern trajectory, but in a decolonial trajectory, is that they show the erasure of the I as a necessary effect of writing the erasure of Palestine. So the erasure of the author, the erasure of the I as this sort of complete whole I in control of the writing, in control of the effects of the writing, etc., etc., the erasure of that I happens as a direct result, as a necessary effect of writing erasure in a real, substantial way. Where you're not trying to accept the erasure of Palestine as a done deal, as a fact of nature that we're now going to just live with, nor are you trying to conceal the destructiveness of that erasure and its ongoing nature. So when you do that, which is much more difficult to do than to just say like I did in writing novels, when you do that, the effect is the erasure of the writing I, the erasure of the author. So what do I mean by that? So very briefly, if we look at Ayyash Khouri's Gate of the Sun, a brilliant novel that still inspires many Palestinian forms of activism today, as many other pieces of literature do. In a short summary, it's basically the book is a kind of a monologue. What looks like a dialogue, but it's really a monologue between two characters. Dr. Khalil, who's still alive, and is very much a character that is afflicted by the shattered state in which he finds himself in. And he's talking to Yunus, who's a freedom fighter who stubbornly resisted the fate of erasure and continuously fought. No matter how much losses he experienced and the Palestinian cause experienced, he just continued to fight no matter what. And now he's lying in a coma at this makeshift hospital. So Yunus is not talking in the story. It's just Dr. Khalil imagining their dialogue, recounting older dialogues they had with each other, and so on. So you have this sort of dialogue between this character who's afflicted by the shattered state of erasure and this character Yunus who's kind of oblivious to the shattered state of erasure. And one of the critical, and I mean it's quite a lot going on in the book, of course, I can't go through it all, and it's been a while since I read it. I wrote this a while back. I wrote this piece before I started writing the book as well. But one of the critical elements that they talk about is how Yunus had built Bab el-Shams, which means Gate of the Sun, in this cave in Palestine. So he was already expelled to Lebanon, and as many Palestinians did, they kind of quote-unquote smuggled themselves back into their own homelands to revisit their destroyed villages, and many of them would use caves. So this was real, right? Like many of them would use caves as hiding places, and Yunus in this story is doing just that. He made this cave a liberated plot of Palestine, and he called it Bab el-Shams, the Gate of the Sun, meaning the sun lives inside the cave. So the cave is in this rendering, the sun lives in the cave because that's the only place where freedom and liberation can reside. And the truth and liberation can only reside inside the darkest of places. The sun can only exist in the darkest of places, not outside. Outside, the Israeli settler colonial project has now eliminated the ability for the sun to shine. Because truth and liberation cannot live out in the open under settler colonial erasure, right? So it can only exist inside the cave. And actually harkens back to a lot of black feminist literature where there is also this kind of idea where the sun of liberation and truth only lies in the darkest places, not out in the open in society, where it is always destroyed the second it shines its light outside of the And one of the critical insights that Dr. Khalil comes to in his monologue with Yunus over, this 9-month ordeal of him talking to Dr. Khalil, talking to Yunus, is that it was always a multiplicity of Yunus that lived inside the cave. That Yunus was not this one figure who could be easily, cornered or discussed as this one being whose core is known and never changes. There's always a multiplicity of Yunuses that he's had these conversations with. And he realizes that in the cave, Yunus could be in his multiplicities. That symbolized the multiplicities of life and the different forms of life that existed in this only liberated plot of Palestine inside this cave. And that outside this cave, if this sun of multiplicity of Yunus was ever to come outside this cave, in the context of colonial modernity, in the context of Israeli settler colonialism, it would be erased. Because the Israeli settler colonial project does not operate on multiplicity. In fact, it operates on the forceful molding of multiplicity into these notions of pure, discrete, distinct races and identities. And the erasure and the expulsion of the Palestinian identity in order to secure the pure Jewish sovereign lord of the land. And I'll talk more about that later. And in fact, he comes to that realization even more when he talks about how on Yunus's death, it was a multiplicity of Yunuses that went to shut down the gate of the sun. That it was Yunus's sons and their sons, all named Yunus. So it's multiplicity coming to the rescue of multiplicity to shut down the cave, because that was the only way to keep that struggle for decolonial liberation going. It was only in the multiplication of the self, of life, of different life forms, that you have the antidote to Israeli settler colonialism, where it is based on this notion of an indivisible, pure, unalloyed sovereign self. So if the Son of Truth and Liberation leaves this space of multiplicity, it will be overpowered by the mono-history in what I would call the dictatorial sovereign I of settler colonial sovereignty. And that is what underpins settler colonial sovereignty. It's a dictatorial sovereign I. It's an I that summons the dictatorial potency of this indivisible, pure, unalloyed, even pre-political substance. It doesn't exist. This is a complete fantasy and mythology. But that is precisely what settler colonial sovereignty rests upon, is that mythology. That aspiration for the creation of this pure, unalloyed, pre-political sovereign self. But just because it's not real, doesn't mean that when it seeks to create that part is not real. That part is all too real. And it leads in what we're seeing today, the genocide of the Palestinian people. That is precisely what underpins Israeli settler colonial sovereignty and other settler colonial projects as well. Is this chase for this pure, unalloyed, like I said, almost pre-political, pure substance of the self that they call the quote-unquote sovereign Jewish self. A complete mythology from beginning to end, but one that has devastating consequences for the Palestinian people. And what you also see in that is how colonial modernity tries to mold and shape the multiplicity of space itself. The malleability of space into this colonial version of place. Because that sovereign, unalloyed, pure sovereign I, it becomes fused with the idea of land as this bounded space, bounded place that belongs to that pure sovereign I. There's a fusion of land and people that happens there that tries to assert the purity of the land to only belong to this, exclusively belong to this pure identity of the self. The whole novel reveals that the ways in which colonial modernity works to shape the malleability of space into these bounded entities we call the nation states under this kind of form of exclusive colonial sovereignty. But it doesn't just do that with space, it does that with time as well. And this is where I bring in Darwish, whose work, I think, reveals that linear progressive version of time of colonial modernity better than does Khoury's text. Although both texts address both elements, just one exists, I find, accentuated more in the other. So in the absence of presence, Darwish's basically autobiography. But it's not an autobiography like your regular autobiography. It's you might be confused when you first read it as to what it is, because it reads like a dialogue when it first starts, and you're like, who's he talking to? And then you discover as you read the book more that it's him writing this book at the end of his life, having a dialogue with himself at each stage of his life, starting when he was in the womb, right? So it's a dialogue between him and himself at each stage of life. And what I think part of the brilliance of the book is that it shows you, in that very technique of writing an autobiography, the impossibility for the Palestinian who has experienced erasure and destruction and elimination and expulsion to speak about the I as a harmonious whole. That the possibility does not exist, especially for those expelled from their land like Darwish was. There's a moment of rupture that can't be undone. You can't just smooth it over and say, I'm whole and complete now. No, there's a rupture that erases the ability for you to become whole and complete. And what is brilliant about Darwish is that he doesn't try to force a harmonious or complete rereading of his life. He just says, every time the capacity to write starts from a position that inevitably scatters me. Right? Like he was about 8 years old when he was expelled, right? It's when I go back to the beginning, I know where the beginning is going to end in scattering at a very early stage. So he doesn't try to then force some kind of wholeness onto that rupture by recreating a different kind of linear story, a linear story that would be centered on rupture, aka postmodernist literature. It is now just letting go of the notion of linearity altogether. And it's just saying the I dissipates in this inability to distinguish between past, present, and future. So I'm not going to try to remake sense of past, present, and future in a different way. I'm just going to accept my condition as not being able to make sense of past, present, and futures like others do. There's laments in his writing, you can feel like laments about like, what might it be like to be able to write about myself as a past, present, future like everybody else seems to be able to. So there's maybe laments about that, but there's no effort to try to force that onto the writing. He accepts that condition, but not in a way that then acquiesces to settler colonial expulsion and elimination. That's the critical part. It resists that. And it tries to do the writing in such a way where it shows the shallowness of all writing that works in a past, present, future neat way. That all writing that tries to create harmony and wholeness in the self, and instead opens up to the multiplicity of the self, the dissipation of the self. But he does something more than that. So here, time kills us. It dissipates the self. And then, there's lines like this in Khoury's novel as well. It's like, when you think about time, what is it doing? It's killing us. Like right now, it's killing me. I'm getting closer to the end of my life. But it's not just like a nihilistic way of understanding that. It's more about how time kills us in the sense of dissipating the self, right? And showing its multiplicities, and how the self is always co-constituted with others. You're never just like in charge of yourself as like a being that exists all on your own. This is the mythology of settler colonial and colonial modernity. But this is where he becomes especially special. He always includes the Israeli other in his writing. He does not shy away from how the Israeli other is also a co-constituent of himself. Now, in Darwish, there isn't a mono-Israeli other. there's different kinds of Israeli others that appear in his writing. The love affair, different kinds, right? But the most important one is the Israeli other that is intent on eliminating the Palestinian. The Israeli other that is seeking to continuously expel, eliminate, and erase the Palestinian. That also appears in his writing. That's, again, much more difficult to accomplish than just said, right? Especially when you get into literature. But it is always there. And that other is, he's trying to grapple in his writing with that other that is co-constituent of the self, but is a co-constituent that is trying to eliminate the self. Expel the self, erase the self, the Palestinian self. So this is what I think, this is why I think the elimination of the erasure of the author is a necessary effect of writing erasure. Because it's not easy to look into a mirror that shows part of the co-constituents is the part that wants me dead, that wants me gone, that doesn't recognize my humanity, etc., etc. So there's always that destructiveness, the brutality of that Israeli other inside the self. So how you deal with that then becomes very critical. And I think that what his work does, what the brilliance of Darwish does, is to show a way of showing how that must necessarily lead to a kind of self-annihilation. But it's not, again, not a nihilistic self-annihilation, not one that acquiesces to settler colonial power, but a self-annihilation that is leading towards the creation of something new. So when he writes about it, he shows how the co-constituency of the self, that includes the destructive, brutal other that wants to destroy and create this pure, unalloyed, discrete, pure race, blah, 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 within the self, how that looks like, how that exists, what does it mean, and then the imagination of something that would counter that would reimagine the co-constituency of the self in a direction that doesn't follow that way of co-constituting the self. So this is not about reconciliation with the brutality of the other that wants to eliminate you. You can't. You can't reconcile with another that says, I am your master and Lord. I am your master and Lord ends the conversation. That's it. No reconciliation is possible. But you can challenge that, oppose that, dismantle that, and create a different kind of co-constituency. And that's why it is necessary to let go of colonial, modernist, and postmodernist imaginaries and practices of space-time and self-other. Because they are built in such a way where they can only lead to a continuation of that process. There's no decolonial liberation if, Palestinians become the masters and lords. That's not decolonial liberation. You can call that some kind of liberation, but it's not the Palestinian liberation, but it's not decolonial liberation, because it did not, in fact, transform the logics and grammars of colonial modernity. And the Palestinian decolonial struggle is nothing short of that. It has to be, if it is going to be fully decolonial, it has to be a radical transformation of colonial modernity. And I think what works of literature like Darwish and Khoury do is allow us to enter a space where, like an imaginary space, where we start to ask ourselves questions that have become more or less stale in colonial modernity. Nobody's really asking in any serious way questions about humanity, the meaning of the social, the meaning of the political, sovereignty, the state. If you stay within the paradigm of colonial modernity, those questions are already answered. There's just debates about tinkering with this and that. It's only, the dreams of a C.L.R. James, the Frantz Fanons, the Edward Sahids, the M.A. Césaires, that there would be a radical questioning of all those things in the creation of an alternative world. And so this is what is required. So what Darwish and Khoury and others, of course, they're not the only two, but those are the two that I focused on, what they enable you to do is to take you back to fundamental questions that colonial modernity has said, stop looking at those. We've answered those. We've reached the apex of humanity on all those questions. You just got to follow it in this stupid development model or that development model or whatever other nonsense. But that's not the task. If we are serious about the Palestinian decolonial liberation as a decolonial liberation against colonial modernity, then it has to be a fundamental transformation of all of those questions, of all of those institutions, and therefore asking some deeper questions about how we organize social and political. So that's why I oppose in the book the question of settler colonial sovereignty versus decolonial sovereignties. And the reason I pluralize decolonial sovereignties is because it precisely can rest on this model of the multiplication of the self, this multiplication of the I, the notion of the dissipation of the self in time, the unboundedness of space, the malleability of place. That once you get into that imaginary theoretical space, then you can start to ask really fundamental questions about how to transform sovereignty. And this is not just purely a theoretical exercise. Decolonial sovereignties already exist in Palestinian resistance. They exist in other areas as well of the world, historically and in the present. It's just a matter of finding the right conceptual frameworks of talking about those so as to, we do now, as well in the humanities and the social sciences, what Fanon said the cultural realm should do, is direct the people towards a different way of thinking about their liberation struggle. They're already doing it. In the popular committees of the First Intifada, they were already practicing decolonial sovereignties. It's just a matter of properly conceptualizing. That's all I'm doing in this book. Just properly conceptualizing actions that already exist in order to guide, who am I to guide? In order to just paint the paths. This path could theoretically lead to a decolonial alternative, a real alternative to not just Israeli settler colonialism, but colonial modernity more broadly. That's the job of theory as I see it. In a nutshell, I'm trying to revisit certain conceptions of space and time and self and others, and self-other relations, in order to remake the unbearability that we see in front of us in Palestine today, the unbearability of the conditions under which Palestinians are forced to live today. I've already spoken for about a half hour, right? Yeah. So maybe I'll end it with this in about 10 minutes. The genocide, because I want to bring it to what's happening today. The genocidal operation in the Gaza Strip is not the first genocide committed against the Palestinian people, nor will it be the last, if nothing changes. It's also not the first genocide that we've seen in this era of colonial modernity. None of this is new. If you've been reading decolonial scholarship, you understand that Zionism is a political project that is born of and for colonial modernity. That is what it is, root and stem. Even prior to the enactment of that ideology in the settler colonial project, it was already racist and settler colonial. Because it accepted all the foundations of colonial modernity. The second that Zionism made the conclusion that there has to be a Jewish state in the mold of the European state, in the land of the East, in order for Jews to become like the rest of the civilized Europeans, it joined the project of colonial modernity. Simple. And it borrowed all it borrowed all the tactics and operations of colonial violence, but that was already inscribed in its foundation. That it operated on this notion of distinct discrete, pure races whose sovereignty and civilization whose civilization depends on the creation of this exclusive notion of sovereignty, this Euro-American mode of sovereignty, that did not exist in the large history of human history. Even in the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, none of them practiced this kind of exclusive sovereignty. They were shared. They had a much more layered and shared mode of sovereignty, with its own brutalities, but nothing compared to this. I say it with complete confidence that this Euro-American colonial project is the most destructive thing ever visited on humanity. So Zionism was always part of that project and continues it. And so what we see here today is simply the intensification of already ongoing structural violences. Particularly Israeli settler colonial structures of genocidal violence and Euro-American imperial structures of violence. Because that's what Israel is for the American Empire. It's an imperial outpost that enables those imperial structures of violence to keep building. So the Palestinian struggle for liberation has always been about that, has always been about challenging these systems of colonial modernity. And that is precisely, by the way, what also scares so many post-colonial regimes around the world. That scares the American empire. That scares the European hegemonic imperial alliance. Is that it does present an alternative to their world. This is why countries that also want to take a jab at that imperial world order, not necessarily to transform it, but to give themselves a better standing in it, that's why they draw on the Palestinian struggle. Because they do see it as a struggle that pokes holes in the story of the Euro-American Empire. They do see it as something that shows clearly that all this talk about international law is a bunch of BS. That all this notion about human rights is a bunch of BS. It shows the hypocrisy of the West like nothing else can. So, but what we need to be doing as decolonial scholars and activists is to push for the Palestinian cause to become this kind of spark plug and guide for, I would say, dying decolonial struggle. The post-colonial state has dealt us a real blow. Let's be upfront. The decolonization struggles of the 20th century aimed for something much bigger than what we ended up with across the world. But these post-colonial states have become very useful in suppressing that desire for true decolonial liberation. But that desire is not dead. That's why people fill the streets. That's why people fill the streets in Yemen. That's why people fill the streets in Malaysia. In the UK! There's people there that also want to get rid of this colonial modernity. In the US, even in Canada. It's because it ignites something in people. It reminds them of what it is that they are really striving towards. And I do think that this potentiality for decolonial liberation is being kept alive by the Palestinian struggle. And I go back to the popular committees very quickly of the First Intifada. This was not the first time that popular committees had appeared in Palestine. They appeared in exactly the same way, more or less exactly the same. Of course, there's comparative analysis to be done, but you know what I mean. In their foundation, very similar to the Palestinian popular committees of the 1930s, when they revolted against British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. They were very similar in how they operated. They created an alternative system of social and political life. It was ruled by the people, for the people, in an actual meaningful way, not the American state way, where elites, white male, property white males wrote the Constitution in what? How long did they take to write the Constitution? Not long. And wrote it for other white property men. This was real governance on the ground, where popular committees appeared everywhere in Palestine to guide the affairs everyday affairs of people's everyday needs, from food to education to healthcare to organizing for mass action, withdrawal of participation from Israeli settler colonial structures, and so on and so forth. And they reimagined sovereignty in that sense. No leadership emerged that said, we're now the central authority, these are our diktats, and everybody has to follow. If you look at the communiques of the national leadership that emerged, it was like, listen to your popular committees. You are the popular committees. So listen to yourselves, is what they were saying. I mean, how many times have you heard that from your governments? That was one of the reasons why the Israeli government was terrified of those popular committees, why they criminalized them. Yitzhak Rabin, the man of peace, criminalized those committees. Because they created, like I said, an alternative structure of governance. And what the Israeli state decided to do with the quote-unquote peace process was to defeat them through the Palestinian authority. And create a semi-post-colonial type of regime that will do the dirty work for the imperial power, and in this case the settler colonial power, in order to continue these structures from being really challenged. So that is, the general picture of how I see decolonial liberation, the role that literature can play, the role that theory can play in understanding the current situation and the path forward for decolonial liberation. And it can come in various forms, and I do acknowledge that there's such a thing as a partial decolonial liberation versus a full decolonial liberation and so on, which I talked about last week at another talk. Happy to do that here if people want, but there's no absolutes in this. But that is what I try to do, is lay out the different paths, and let's just be upfront about where we are and where we're going, and what might each set of actions guide us to. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Well, wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Muhannad. I think we can easily keep you here for a few more hours and a few more talks. But definitely for today, I think we're going to have a robust conversation. I have my own comments and questions. The paper was really beautiful and inspiring for so many reasons, but I have a deep interest in partition in Palestine-Israel, and the reason, and I say both because, in a sense, that co-constitution is one of the big ethical, political, and, as you put it, first and foremost, aesthetic problematics to deal with. And so that kind of opening is incredibly, I think the generosity in this move, it reminds me of the kind of hospitality that was palpable during the political transition and in the kind of move towards the political transition and negotiations in South Africa. And I'm saying that because of the feeling, not because of the analogy. So I just want to be careful to not kind of push an analogy that, in my own reading, has come to the end of its life. And so what we're, and I would ask now with comments and questions to hold the kind of particularities of the Palestine-Israel kind of question, let's say, in mind when responding to Muhannad's paper and the talk that he gave. So I'm going to hold back on my own comments and questions and open up for a first round. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Should we take two or three comments?
Sounds good.
And then you can deal with it as you wish. We've got time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Premish, first off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by that presentation. I mean, I'm really grateful for your laying out of the problematic that, I've been tussling with, partly because I'm not a scholar of the Middle East, but I've been deeply committed to thinking what about this problem we share in the question of apartheid and its aftermaths and aftermaths. But two terms you used set my mind racing. The one was indivisible and the other was substance. And of course those hark back to 18th century birth of rational philosophy. And we know that in some sense that degraded script is what gave us firstly not only slavery but colonialism. And in its aftermath, kind of decimation of the partitioned world that we inhabit in different forms after the Second World War. So I was thinking about, where the endpoints of that narrative, where they land. And in some respects, they land in the condition of the nation state, which you interestingly mark as the problem of post-coloniality. I always thought that that would be a different way to think of, that post-coloniality would be a critique of nationalism for one, but also the nation state as a condition. So I'm thinking about what we name this other space we want to be in. And I'm wondering whether, and I'm thinking here particularly about a critique in 1976 around the question when black consciousness became a phenomenon in South Africa. The Review of African Political Economy invited Martin Legasik and Harold Walpy, who were ideologues of different factions of the left movement and the Marxist tradition in South Africa, to write a paper on the question of decoloniality and capital. And they have a debate with Keano and argue that apartheid was in fact not a decolonial problem. That in fact, if you thought about the movements in capital, that something else was afoot. And so I want to ask again here, the names we give things are often also the ways we chart paths out of the predicaments that we find ourselves in. What we do with this hyper-technologized capital and the way in which today the reports on AI as a kind of function of this genocide and its execution. You're dealing with a technology that is being tested in the midst of a genocide that is unfolding. How do we score and square that set of questions? So I'm asking, I hear your point about, that there's an intensification but a repetition without difference. So that I agree with. But I'm wondering about intensification, because that would also bring together a different configuration of time and space in the way that Paul Virilio imagines it through the book on the information bomb, but also this masochism of speed that is producing untenable conditions of life for which the nation state is just inadequately prepared to even grapple with. I don't know if that gets you into it's more conversation and a curiosity about what we name this problem, and whether the rush to ground to name it decoloniality might be premature before we anticipate all the configurations of power that are at play.
Do you want to remind on that? Should I take
Yeah,
that?
sure. Yeah, let's do that. I like that. I like that. The mulling and take more.
Okay.
Yeah. Unless nobody has more and people want more time, then I can sort of
Let's kill the conversation.
No, not at all. No.
Thank you, Muhannad. And maybe to pick up off the premise, but thank you for the paper and for sharing it with us, and it's good to be able to talk through it with you, and for bringing the arts on the table and in the discourse, because we're just bombarded by so much coverage that speaks in different languages, that doesn't invite metaphor, that doesn't invite imagination, that doesn't invite, I would say, the feminized spaces, and not feminine as in a quality of gender, but feminine as an alterity, as an alternative. I'll talk about that, but I'm speaking about the AI. So just after reading your paper, and I'm just going to speak, but I'm reading in Al Jazeera about, they've just discovered that AI is being used to the AI programs are directing the bombing. They're using it to profile. In fact, sadistically named the lavender. To term an AI program that is designed to profile Hamas informants and then is used to direct the down bombing. And you spoke in the paper about the singular and the specific and the specified. And it's so interesting that the means of eradication are working against the individual. that this AI, the program that is being designed, is actually designed to target spaces and home spaces and the space of the house. So an individual is believed or is known by the AI to stay in that dwelling place. So the whole dwelling place is being targeted irrespective of the casualties. So that entire home and household place is being eradicated by the machine that is being designed within the within a very specific perspective. So, you know, this concept of place and the individual, place and the specified, actually that specificity is, there is no specificity in, I mean, it's a different type of specificity where the individual does not exist, where the individual is already deemed erased. And then I was just thinking the metaphor of the cave, the parable of the cave, and I'm thinking of the place of parables, the place of storytelling in a war that is targeting children, so, that is eliminating the child, the minor, and what it means to nurture spaces of imagination, not just imagination, but a space for generation, for generative. And so I was thinking of the subterranean, not as a subterranean that hides, subterranean right now is the place where the enemy hides out and is building networks, but actually subterranean as a space, as an alternative space to this light that is literally the light of annihilation.
I think these are really incredibly rich and meaty responses. So maybe we can pause and give you time to mull and respond and develop your response aloud.
And it's I don't even want to think about it as a response, as opposed to, like we just said, like a conversation. So to kind of actually clarify in terms of my own argument, I actually argue that the nation state is not as significant as the question of sovereignty. Right. Yeah. So it's you know. Okay. Let me start it that way, and then reach into how I think about the nation state towards the end of the book, which is so in the beginning, what I say is that the question of sovereignty is the more critical one, because it is something that operates not just underneath and not even before, after. It's not even thinkable. It's just underneath, through, and beyond the nation state. And the notion of an indivisible, pure, omnipresent settler colonial sovereignty is, of course, never real, never exists in real practice. But since that is the aspiration of the settler sovereign, it gives rise to all sorts of projects that are just audacious when you really think about it. Right? The notion that you have the right to eliminate an entire society and replace it, the idea that you have the right to enslave millions of people, the idea that you have the right to say, the rest of humanity should follow what I think man is. These are attributes that the majority of human societies have left in the realm of the gods, or God. Never even dared touch them as a thing that humans can do. But this is what the Euro-American project does. And nothing to do with them being white or European or none of that nonsense. But this is what we ended up with in the contingencies and experiments, the contingencies and the shitty luck in this case of history. Yeah. Is that we ended up with this empire emerging at this particular historical period in this particular location that had the audacity to think that it was God. Make man in its own image. It literally is doing that, right? Like, these are things that we only associate with the realm of the gods. In previous empires, never even dared to think of doing these things. The Mongols were like, oh, you keep ruling yourselves. Just pay us tribute. And if you don't, we'll kill you. So it's brutal, don't get me wrong. But they never thought, like, we're going to remake the political for you. Never did that. Romans didn't do that. The did. French did. The Dutch did. They were like, yeah, we're going to remake them into our own image. So that when they resist us like people like us. So they're always behind us. So we maintain our rule over them. This is such a despicable idea. But it is driven by that aspiration towards indivisibility and so on. So that's why I focus on that. Now, within that realm, you have the construction of this thing called the nation state. And I tend to agree with like historians like Burbank. These are not decolonial historians, right? Like they were empire states for the longest time. Nation states are like at most a couple of 100 years old. You know, the overwhelming majority of nation states are less than that. Israel is 75. That's it, right? It's 75 years old. So now the question of decoloniality and the nation state then becomes a much larger question with tons of debate around it. I mean, I tend to always just go back to the ideas of Fanon and Said and others that had this ambivalence toward the nation state. They just saw it as a tool that achieves this grander goal. It has not ended up being that. It has become the final goal. and particularly the post-colonial regimes. And that's why I try to use the term regimes more than the nation state. Post-colonial regimes became part of the infrastructure of empire. And you know, it's not just me saying that. People on the streets are always saying that. Like, you go talk to Egyptians today, they can't wait to get rid of that regime. They want to desperately. They're just not it's not easy. It's not easy to do. So and then you add the question of capitalism in it, and capital and AI and all of these things that make the task ahead even that much more gargantuan in terms of resistance. Now, I do tend to, in terms of the larger question of capitalism and settler colonialism, I do tend to agree with Gurminder Bambara, Glenn Coulthard. I'm more on their side of it, where, of course, you know, I'm writing a paper right now on racial capitalism in Palestine, so it's something to be taken very seriously and analyzed. Like, I agree with all those analyses, but to me, it's not the backbone. The backbone always remains in settler colonialism dispossession, not proletarianization. That's what Coulthard says, basically, and I think he's right. And Bambara takes it to the level of in her very excellent 2020 article on challenging the Nancy Fraser way of framing capitalism, and she goes, well, none of it is possible without, none of these transformations within capitalism are possible without colonialism and the slave trade and slavery and settler colonialism. And each stage can, in fact, even the welfare state, right? Like as theorists of capitalism from a purely political economic perspective will look at, like, the welfare state arises as of labor movements. Well, yeah, but if there wasn't all the wealth they generated from robbing the world blind, there wouldn't have been money to share in the welfare state to begin with. You know, it's always part of that story of capital and capitalism. That to me has to be understood within that context of colonial modernity always. And you know, there are others, of course, better placed than me to talk about AI and these kinds of technologies and techniques. But how I sort of always think about all of those new techniques that we're seeing today. So, for example, the focus on space is not new in the Israeli, I call them genocide forces. Eyal Weizman was talking about similar things that you just described from 2007, right? Like of how they attack space as opposed to people. In their training, how they read Deleuze and Guattari to do that, right? Like his famous article on that. And other postmodern theory that the IDF was using to train their soldiers on how to attack spaces as opposed to people, and how, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But of course it's intensified, and yeah, I mean, I'm like you, I listen to people who know AI better than I do, and they talk about that in terms of the technicalities and all of it, but to me, theoretically, it always goes back to the logic of elimination and expulsion. That's what underpins it all to this day. Because the whole thing about attacking space in this case, in the genocide, is to make the land uninhabitable. They don't need to kill everyone. But if there are no hospitals, no schools, no universities, no economy, no agricultural field, no fishing, no communications, no infrastructure, how are you going to live there? That's their goal. Their goal is to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible from the Gaza Strip. Has been from day one. And they're doing it step by step. Whether it works or not remains to be seen. Palestinians are resilient. They might still find a way to live on that land. But the Israelis are working very hard to make it impossible for people to inhabit that land. And the Israelis have always viewed that they have time. Time is on their side, not on the Palestinian side. So if it takes them 3 years to do this, well, we got time. It doesn't have to be that everybody leaves today. If you make the land uninhabitable, eventually they'll leave. And people will forget, they'll move on. They're counting on this, by the way. The Israelis and the Americans are counting on this. A couple of years from now, you all will have just moved on. Maybe not you, but the general public, they think, we'll just move on. We'll move on to the next thing. And people will forget. And when it empties drip by drip, you don't have the 24-hour coverage that you're getting right now from only like Al Jazeera and other stations, not in mainstream media. But yeah, that's their thinking. So attacking space is precisely still part of this eliminatory project of Palestinian life on the land. And they believe that one day they'll just, once it's empty of the Palestinians, they'll come and take it. Just like they've done in every other piece that became Israel. How did you think it came into being? Exactly like this. Different technologies, different techniques, but exactly like this in terms of the logics. And I do quite love the subterranean sort of idea. You know, the one thought that came to mind is you mentioned children as well, is how that survives inside someone's imagination as well. That every Palestinian probably carries that somewhere. Their truth, the light of truth and liberation remains within the body of every Palestinian. Even if we can't recreate it in a cave like they do in the story, that cave is inside us. And that's something Israel can't get to. Which is why the resistance will never die. Which is why Israel will never actually succeed. In the long, long term, they will never succeed in this project. It's impossible. We've not given up over 100 years. We're not giving up forever. So even if they do succeed, even in this, in the eradication of Gaza, it's not over. So that whole aspiration for the creation of exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty, colonial sovereignty over the entire land, even if they actually find a place where they're like, we finally achieved it, we've created Greater Israel, it's over, it's not over. There will be war. Guaranteed. There will be a war that upends that. Nothing taken by force remains held by force forever. That is the rule of history. And to avoid that path, I only know of one other one. And that is economic and political isolation of the Israeli state. That's the only path towards de-Zionization and moving towards something like what I'm talking about. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
There's a list, but you're here for a few days.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So the first question, my first question / comment, but I really would be grateful for your view, is that what you've put on the table, at least with this chapter, which I found very moving, because it takes on the task, and this is a point of huge debate and contestation, it takes on the task from the perspective of what could be called, or what you point to as Palestinianization, to also offer an analysis for de-Zionization. Now, I know inside 1948, inside Israel, the big debate has been, and not only inside, outside, has been, you know, that there's been firstly a naturalization of a partitionist paradigm, sensibility, but also a kind of justifiable moral refusal to also, as the oppressed, take on the work of de-Zionization. Besides it being impossible at some level, it's also been seen as a kind of unjust labor, that why should the labor of liberation fall both on the oppressed, but also the liberation of the oppressor fall on the shoulders of the oppressed. And what you're actually presenting is very much the kind of gesture, gift, vision, hospitality that South Africans received, particularly those race white. In other words, particularly those implicated in the regime of apartheid simply by virtue of an accident of birth, right? So it's not essentializing, but it's saying as a class, as a collective, and apartheid in South Africa resided in the unmaking of black people as individuals, right? So it was to create blackness as an agglomeration, always as a collective, always as mob, gang. I mean, it fed into a whole discursivity that was politically instrumentalized. But that work of both providing a vision of freedom that those who were the oppressors, or who are historically implicated in being, you know, in the oppressor class, in the perpetrator, or let's say colonizer class, that work to offer a vision, which is intellectual work, but it's much more. You know, your paper points to the absolute crucial area of the kind of psychic effects of annihilation, of extermination, of displacement, of settler colonialism, of apartheid, of partition and occupation. And I know those all I'm putting into a bag one set, a whole lot of concepts that do different work in the context that you've laid out for us. But it does seem from your paper and from your talk that you're proposing, this is the task of liberation, the intellectual task for liberation, is to say you too can de-Zionize, and this is how. That without annihilating your ego, you will experience the dissolution which is existential. Now, to tell that to Jews as a collective is pretty powerful, given the terrible kind of convergence of historical unfoldings that make the Jewish occupier, colonizer, overlord also the third generation survivor from the concentration camps. Right, which makes this, I mean, the particular predicament of Palestine incredibly complex in a way that I don't think we have a view of exactly. So with that very long-winded preamble, to both ask you to perhaps comment on that task that you have appeared to set for Palestinian national liberation struggle, and how in that task you're also saying, without explicitly saying, and perhaps it's a saying that needs to stay in the cave for now, that there is a way to live beyond an identity that creates you as the overlord.
Yes.
So, yeah, if you could respond to that, I think it would be amazing to hear you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And as I say in the chapter, you know, it is an unfair ask, but the world is not fair. What are you going to do? look, there is, Zionism, like I said, is irredeemable. It's settler, colonial, and racist root and stem, but Jewish life on the land is not irredeemable. And it can exist on the land, but it can't be Zionist. It's not complicated. And therefore the land can be shared in that way, and where we open up to the multiplicity of the self in a real substantial way. So now, in terms of the, okay, so in terms of, let me just kind of jump to this part first and then address some of your comments. In terms of how de-Zionization can come about, it can only come about through pressure. There's no path towards de-Zionization from within the Israeli community. There's no path of de-Zionization that the Palestinians can enforce on the Israeli community. That does not, neither path exists. It is only if Israel is completely isolated politically, economically, and pressured legally, that then Israelis will have to start to consider these questions. And will have to then be forced into de-Zionization. There's no other way. You're going to be forced into de-Zionization either through war or this way. There's no other way. You're not going to do this forever. Nobody stays Lord forever. It never happened. Why do you think it would happen this time? It won't. So this is actually, it's in their self-interest to transform into a different path. And that different path can only be traveled with Palestinians. So if you're going to do that, then you have to then de-Zionize by necessity. So, and vice versa. Palestinians cannot bring about a decolonial liberation without Israelis. Unless you do engage in a war of annihilation, there's no other way. You're living with them. And if you do a war of annihilation, I mean, first of all, that's many years away. Like I said, it will happen, but that won't be good for anybody. What's that going to do? It's going to create another nation state that looks like the Euro-American one with lordship and all the rest of it. It's not going to be real liberation, decolonial liberation. So the only real path for Palestinians to actually travel down a path of decolonial liberation is to eventually figure out a different way of living with Israelis. So it might look like a very, like you said, generous thing and all of it, but it's also a real politique thing too. And different people will come at it from different perspectives. I'm not naive, right? Like some people do need the self-interest to act. Not everybody will just go on the basis of aspirations for decolonization and the rest of it. Some people need self-interest and real politique in the discussion. And that would be it for them. It's in your self-interest to avoid a genocide and war. I don't see a better self-interest than that. And the prospect of actually building something that is worthy of aspiration the world over, I mean, that alone should inspire people to act in that direction. So, you know, if we take seriously what I talked about in terms of what Darwish taught, and what Khoury teaches, and what many others teach, of the multiplicity of the self, of the co-constituency of the self, then that becomes the ground from which you work, and then you work from there without thinking about, am I being generous or am I being? You just do. You follow what is right. You follow truth. You follow justice. You follow those two things, and you go where that takes you. You know, I understand why some see it as an unfair ask. I understand why some see it as asking too much of the oppressed. But I ultimately think that in order for it to get to where we want to go, everybody will have to actually participate equally. So it's not like I can liberate Jews or Israelis. I can't. They have to actually do the work themselves. They have to de-Zionize first, and then get on the task of building this alternative world with me. So it's not going to be about me carrying all the load, or Palestinians carrying all the load. Moreover, it is very critical to not do what was done here, which is to say, we're not going to really address the historical and current injustices. That's, like to me, for example, land redistribution is part of the foundation of the alternative. The Palestinian right of return is part of the foundation of the alternative. These are not things that we arrive at after we start to build the alternative. No, these are the starting points. Because if you wait until afterwards, you find yourself in some of the situations that you find yourself in here. Land redistribution happening through gentrification, as you showed me last week. It's not even land redistribution, it's the continuation of expulsion from the land through gentrification. So you end up with these even more complex things that you can't pinpoint and address the same way that you can at certain moments in history. It becomes much more difficult to address them later than in the moment of change, in the moment of transformation. So to me, it's critical that things like land redistribution and the Palestinian right of return, and I am a proponent of communal ownership as well, to address some of the problems with capitalism. As I said in my talk on Saturday, one of the advantages that the case of Palestine and Israel enjoys over others in terms of land redistribution is because Israel is a racist project, they don't have large private ownership. Approximately 93% of the land outside of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is owned by the state or by quasi-state agencies. The reason being simple. If it is purely free market capitalism, a rich Palestinian can come and buy all the land. So because they want it to be Jewish land, because it's a racist project, the state owns it. Nice, makes land redistribution a lot easier. So you can advocate for communal ownership and land redistribution in ways that are not possible in other contexts there. But that to me has to be part of the foundational part of the alternative, and the Palestinian right of return. There's no ways around that. So I make it very clear that the guiding post for the decolonial alternative path is the Palestinian path. Not because it's Palestinian by culture or nationality or identity or anything like that. It's because that is the path that occupies the position of the colonized. That is therefore the path that can lead to decolonization. Israelis can join that path because it's not defined by identity or nationality. It's defined by political positionality.
Right.
Therefore, anybody can join any political positionality if they wish. As some Israelis do. Very few, and those who do leave because they can't live there anymore, but you can join it. Yeah. Does that answer?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we're going to continue this conversation. I think it's an incredibly courageous position to open up and to put forward, and particularly at this moment. And I think there's something so important in doing it, because what it does is it resists succumbing to the possibility of producing a mirror opposite, which is deeply understandable given what's happening. The intense, I mean, it's so overwhelming, the intensity of this annihilation and displacement, that it's very difficult to not have this visceral response as extreme, and to hold this other possibility open now is also holding open a possibility for thinking and for thought. And what we're witnessing, I think, takes it away, it attenuates thinking. One's so overwhelmed by the effect on the body and the mind and just on all, all parts of one's being. I cannot imagine what it is to be Palestinian in this moment. And so to kind of offer a space of thought is a gift that was, for us. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the chair and stop speaking so much, and you know, and ask for comments, questions from the audience.
What you've just spoken about is what we went through to some degree in South Africa. That the sort of hope for freedom in the future, as spaces get destroyed, comes into the human body, and the African liberation struggle was what gave people space at that time already, which made it great in its conception. Where we sit today is a different space, but in a sense, Israel refused to, at some stage, to take a step in that direction. And for historical and sort of global geopolitical reasons, it's being reinforced into this, unthinkable violence and devastation. And linked to that is the minds that get reshaped as this conflict goes on. So we must not underestimate what happened in South Africa. I'm saying as an older person, these very debates were happening at that time. Do whites have a role in the struggle? The kind of African sense of humanity that has been inclusive throughout history came through in a modernist kind of political articulation, but it was populated by ordinary people who changed South Africa through the pressure you're talking about that is necessary to change, to de-Zionize. So thank you for an amazing talk, and the idea of, the spaces going into the body and the home today with technology and going underground in Gaza is just like takes our minds into different spaces of thinking. But as you say, 7 weeks after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed, 20,000 Madagascans were murdered by the French in Madagascar in a sort of reign of open terror. So that this modernity and classical European traditions of thought and so on have always been accompanied by this violence. And today, the point you made that it's actually no different to what's happened before and what will still happen is a terrifying thought to hold on to. Particularly with technology and the link with technology and global capital, I suppose. And new forms of domination emerge with new forms of holocausts and destructions.
I agree.
Well, thank you. You just, I'm just responding to both of you.
No, I appreciate that.
Any other? Yes.
I'm a student, and I'm wanting to know. Firstly, thank you. The way you presented it, I loved it. Precious amount. Wanting to know if in your readings about Palestine and that history and more so the kind of force that the Israeli state kind of exerts on the body, and increasingly so at rapid speed, etc., etc., etc. Has anybody grappled with the kind of madness of that? Like to be able to do that, I don't know, intuitively I feel you must be absolutely crazy. So I'm just asking, have people grappled with the possibility of this being a madness? That is kind of, and in which ways, if you could maybe...
Yeah, I mean, so there's certainly like a lot of people like in psychology in these fields that look at it from a psychoanalysis perspective or a psychological perspective and that sort of thing. How I actually explain it is that this is what settler colonial violence does. Settler colonial violence is cyclical. So the notion of cycles of violence is usually, the way that it's used in public discourse is misleading to describe what is happening. Right? Like, so the way that people go, oh, another cycle of violence between Palestinians and Israelis, meaning Palestinians did this, the Israelis did that, Palestinians did this in return, and that cycle of violence is happening again. That's not an accurate description of the reality. The real cycle of violence is precisely one that is internal to the settler colonial logic of violence. Every act of settler colonial violence begets the next one, because they can never actually expel all the Palestinians. Even if they do get rid of large numbers, as they have done in the past, as they're trying to do today, there'll always be Palestinian resistance to that, which means that the process of expulsion never stops. So that actually, to me, becomes the defining feature of the Israeli subjectivity. I'll use that term. It becomes a subjectivity of lordship, what I call it. Not an Israeli subjectivity in the content that it's filled in national discourse or in media or whatever. It's the casing of the Israeli subjectivity is one of lordship, meaning that it is continuously trying to establish Israelis as lords of the land, which means that they have to continuously expel the Palestinian. That's why they've been expelling the Palestinian for over 100 years and will continue to do that forever, as long as the Israeli state project continues. Because there will always be Palestinian resistance, therefore every act of expulsion gives rise to more resistance, therefore more acts of expulsion, etc. It never stops. And then what that ends up doing is that it actually changes, it drives the subjectivity into one that is more and more defined by just that. And then that appears at madness, eventually. When it becomes so ensconced in the violence of expulsion, to a normal person, you'll look at it as madness. You can't explain it. You can't explain something that is that gleeful in its murdering of children, as we're seeing today in the snuff films and all these popular channels and all the videos that they're releasing on Twitter and everywhere else, of them gleefully celebrating the killing of Palestinians. For regular people who are appalled by that, any person with an ounce of decency in them is appalled by that. Within the settler colonial society, it becomes, it's driven so far towards the subjectivity of lordship that starts to appear as normal. By the way, a lot of people noticed that in white South Africans in the 90s and early 2000s. I met white South Africans while I was traveling in those days, and the things that they thought, even to a brown person like me, that they thought were acceptable things to say, people would go, what the hell is wrong with these people? Like, that is so racist what they just said. But they're talking about it in very normalized ways, precisely because the structure that they're in drives them towards that subjectivity of lordship, of actually then coming to believe that you are the superior race, and that everybody else is not really human, and that therefore everything that you do is justified. Not just justified, but celebrated. Because you're defending not just the superiority of your race, the purity of your race, which means you're defending civilization, because those two things become associated. So that's how I explain it, and it should appear as madness. That means you're still human if you're seeing it that way, because it's obviously beyond the pale. But within that structure, those soldiers that are doing those heinous crimes, they're celebrated within Israeli society. Because settler colonial violence does that to it. And they think, they have this insane idea that they can come back from this. The people who are not, the elites that are not doing the killing. It's like that demographer in 2005, the Israeli demographer, that was a big, one of the big brains behind the besiegement of Gaza. He said, we're going to basically create them into bigger animals, and then our boys will just have to go and kill every once in a while, mow the lawn, that sort of thing. And he said, my only concern is how do we then rehabilitate our boys to come back into normal society after they do all that killing? Right? And they think of it as just like a psychological problem, give them some counseling and then it'll be okay. But this is insane thinking. And this also explained their increasing fascism, right? If people think that Israeli politics are going to come and save the day, you're deluding yourself. Even if it goes away from the far right back to a center right, because that is what would go back to. Gantz is not center or left, he's center right. Even if it goes back to that momentarily after this, because of pressure from the Americans, it's going to swing right back to the fascist right immediately after that. Because that is what settler colonial violence does to people. And that also becomes a big part of its demise as well. Like I said, in the short and in the intermediate terms, they might quote unquote succeed. But in the long term, they're doomed. And they are on a path of self-destruction. How many Palestinians are going to take down with them? And I forgot to mention this earlier in your comment as well. A critical part of de-Zionization is to resuscitate and revive, not that they're dead, because they are still appearing in anti-Zionist Jewish communities, but resuscitate and revive away from the absolute dominance of Zionist discourse, not just in Israel, but let's not kid ourselves, in Jewish communities in Canada and the US, South Africa. Revive and resuscitate what I would call non-Zionist elements of Jewish suffering. So Zionism presents itself as the antidote to Jewish suffering in Europe, in anti-Semitic Europe. Not just the Holocaust, but prior to it, right? And it paints itself as the only way to resolve that suffering, and as the only authoritative voice on describing that history and its trajectory into today. De-Zionization would of course it's not true, de-Zionization involves the going back to those experiences in a way that actually brings back their decolonial potentiality, where they come to take a different path than the one that Zionism did. And instead of joining colonial modernity, as Zionism did, they would join the decolonial liberation struggle. You know, I have many problems with Zizek, especially on this issue, but when he wrote a piece in the Haaretz, I think it was back in October or November, saying Palestinians and Israelis should get together and fight the real enemy, which is Europe, right? He's not the first to say it. Just Mas'ad had said it before, Edward Said had said it before, other Israeli non-Zionists and anti-Zionists have said it before. So there is some truth to that. So there is a way and it's not Europe per se, but the European project, the Euro-American project, that can be revived in a way where we can now put ourselves on the same path towards this common enemy that we are going against. And I make no, I'm not shy about saying that, you know, what I'm talking about here is not what elite classes want in imperial US or imperial Canada or any of those places. I don't care, though. They're adversaries. They're not. I'm not here to please everyone. A decolonial struggle is not here to make friends, but it is on the side of the majority of the people, of the oppressed, against those structures. So, yeah. So that's. I wanted to come back to that. So I forgot to address that.
Thank you. I think if we're drawn to an end, I would like to just ask if anyone who's asked a question would like to ask another or make a comment. You know, there were one or two people that looked like they were thinking about putting up their hands, but didn't. Okay. Rita.
I was just wondering, since you were saying you were on your way to write a paper on racial capitalism in Palestine. I don't know, I was wondering about this idea of resilience, which is quite a neoliberal term that is used everywhere. Every company has to be quite resilient. They use it in the military as well. They train soldiers to be more resilient, and they use mindfulness techniques or whatever to do that. And one of the authors I read was saying that if you take this to its inevitable or to its conclusion, it kind of means that you have to be resilient in kind of an unlivable. So in South Africa, we have kind of situations where it's kind of the market creates conditions which, obviously not as intense as Palestine, but, could be seen as quite, demoralizing. And so then I don't really know a lot about Sumud, but I read a little about this, and so there's also this idea of resilience as resistance, and how do you distinguish those? And also, is resistance sometimes just persisting, and then other times it is sort of aiming for something like a more expansive view of freedom. But I don't know, if you have any ideas on how to make sense of that contradiction.
Yeah, sure. So first, Sumud is usually translated as perseverance. I like Rahab Nazal's more accurate, I think, translation, steadfast perseverance. So that's a little different than resilience. I think it's okay. So I always like to think of this question of words and concepts and how they get taken up and etc. There's nothing inherent to any word or concept. Maybe there's some few exceptions, but I think for the most part, there's nothing inherent in them that means they must mean this or that. And there's practically no word or concept that becomes popularized by activists or by scholars or however from the oppressed, from the ranks of the oppressed, that doesn't at some point become co-opted. Now, I don't agree with the strategy of every time they co-opt a term, then we got to drop it. What are we doing? We're just going to keep coming up with terms, and then they co-opt that one, and then we come up with a term, and then they co-opt it. Like, I don't see that as very useful. So, like, some people want to drop decolonization because universities have co-opted it. Well, they have, but like, what are we going to, like, are we just going to keep doing this? This has become a little bit like a game as opposed to something meaningful, as far as I'm concerned. So we have to insist on the meaning of the words, and we have to insist on calling out co-optation for what it is, and then naming the power structures that co-opt and why it is that they co-opt. So always direct the discussion that way, as opposed to saying, give up that word, right? Like, some people go, well, Zionists have co-opted indigeneity and we can't use that anymore. No! The way they co-opted it is insane. They don't understand what it means. They co-opted decolonization too. So did the Americans. The Americans called their War of Liberation, independence, against the British as decolonization. Like, no, you don't just concede that to them. You say that's insane, and you explain the structures of power in which that co-optation happens, and then you insist on the meaning that you give those words. That's the fight. Not let's keep changing terms every time they co-opt something. I'm not sure exactly in terms of like the specificities of what you were referring to in terms of resilience, but resilience to me is not a word that necessarily belongs to the market or capitalism or the military or anything like that. How we understand it on the ground is different than how these institutions understand it, and we have to make clear what that distinction is, as opposed to always, jumping from one word to the other. There are certain words that you can say, okay, that one's been like co-opted so badly, we can't resuscitate it. Like, we lost that battle, just drop that one. I get it if that happens, but I think people are a little bit too quick to give up on certain ideas. Like, I think decolonization is one of those. Like the people that want, I see this on Twitter all the time, of scholars, activists from the left saying, like, we shouldn't use decolonization anymore. Like, no. No, just make sure that we call out the co-optation, make sure that we call out the structures of power, and we continue on our path, because I don't see any other way. Like, continuing to chase after some word that's going to capture us and be unco-optable, that doesn't exist. They can co-opt anything. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers or addresses your question, but yeah, I mean, and in terms of the larger question of racial capitalism, and there's lots of scholarship on that in Palestine. The sort of focus that I'm going to take into it is how Israeli settler colonialism feeds capitalist interests in the U.S. and elsewhere. That is one of, if that element doesn't exist, the U.S. doesn't do this with Israel. Like, forget the discourse of values and the only democracy in the Middle East and a Jewish state and that's what they care about, and it's all nonsense. If it wasn't making them money hands over fist, they wouldn't be supporting a genocide. Biden called it openly in the 80s and in the last year, before the genocide, called it an investment. You only call things an investment when you expect a return. He's been in Congress and in the White House long enough to know they get a return. And the return is not just in monies made for the weapons industry and the financial industries, but it's also in all the work that Israel does for the U.S. When the U.S. is supporting some fascist government in Latin America or the Caribbean, who's funding or who's training and arming those fascist regimes? Israel. Who's collecting intelligence for the American empire in the region and beyond? Israel. They do a lot of dirty work for them. They view it as this unbelievable base that they have, military base that does a lot of their work for them on the global level. So that's the racial capitalism aspect. These are the material interests that drive these interconnections between the U.S. empire and others like Canada and Australia and the UK and France and others with Israel. And Israel knows that it's playing that role. Like, it understands. Zionism has always understood that they needed a great superpower to make their state possible. And they understood that there was a price to pay for that they would not ever have true independence. They would always have this dependency on a great superpower, but they were willing to pay that price, and they can push back on it, as we've seen. But those pushbacks, those back and forths that we see sometimes publicly between the Americans and the Israelis, they're never serious in terms of challenging the foundational relationship.
Performative.
Yeah. Performative, and some of it is driven by real things, and they're trying to see how far they can get with the other. But they ultimately both know that they need each other. Now, the Americans can drop them quicker than the Israelis can drop the Americans. The Americans can survive a world without Israel. They'll be weaker for it, and that's good for everyone, but Israel obviously cannot survive without the U.S. So there is, ultimately the power is in the Americans' hands, for sure.
Is there time?
Let's do one more,
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
We do
I have a
time.
very poorly baked question, but as you're talking, so let me half formulate it and we can discuss it afterwards. It's really kind of, maybe it pushes a little bit with the question that Rita asked about, I'm thinking about the parallels that were drawn with the anti-apartheid struggle, and I'm thinking about where we've landed. I mean, you talked about gentrification and the restitution, with the cultural dimension of these global struggles. I mean, in both cases there's a kind of a global diasporic element to that struggle. In your case, in the Palestinian-Israeli case, it's somewhat profoundly different, because there's the claim that Israel makes in the wake of the long history of Judaism and its diasporic memories and struggle now. And then there's the kind of, I wondered if you could just comment on, I guess, how to make sense of all of this. I'm thinking of it also because of you raised the question about the sovereignty of the individual and the ways by using the literary in your paper, in the argument. I'm interested in thinking about how one engages with, and I suspect in different genre formulations it may manifest differently. But I wondered if you could talk about it. I'm also thinking, because I'll end now with what is another component of it in Cape Town that is kind of maybe a way to think about, to think generatively with this, is the ways in which the global soft power of Zionism works in different places, including Cape Town, and then the ways in which the potentiality for a different imaginary can emerge from the kinds of conversations that we have here about Palestine and the global nature of the struggle.
There is one more question.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then we'll wrap up.
Yes, sounds good.
So I mean, I love to talk, and I'm really generative and I mean exciting, especially the connections between like the critique that Fanon makes around the construction of race and whiteness and blackness, and that's where my research is based. So I have a slightly half-baked question, like what Valmont was saying, which is so the structure is, the structure of sovereignty is conceptual, right? In the sense that it can be filled with anything, right? So in terms of inherency, I mean, it can be Zionist, it can be white, it can be, etc., etc. And it hinges on the production of a colonized, enslaved, objectivized other, right? The experience of that necessitates the resistance and the need to overthrow the system, right? But can that experience be a ground for a future? I guess I'm thinking of the question of that the pathway is Palestinian, and how we fill that conceptual position, if you follow what I'm saying. So for example, Amy Césaire would say that, so negritude is an unraveling of this system. It's taking what the mechanism of objectification to break the system itself for a people to come who will be black. Right. So he kind of seems to suggest that something else needs to arrive. That there is a certain there's a certain invention that needs to happen, and maybe that's why you go to the literary. I don't know. So yeah, it's not really a question, more as a sort of throw that in there.
It's a half-baked
thing to discuss around.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate both of your comments, and maybe it's because I'm also a little bit tired that I might not have gotten exactly where you're trying to get at. But we can continue the conversation and let me know, like, so that I can kind of get a better sense of what you're trying to get at. But okay, so let me take it this way first. So in terms of its, and maybe the two are connected in this sense. In terms of its global reach, right? What I think being being Palestinian is a very material thing, of course, right? First and foremost. But it's also has become, I think, a political consciousness, especially in this moment, where people now associate Palestinian being with a particular kind of political consciousness that is facing the sort of biggest odds, yet refusing to accept its fate by quite substantially strong structures of power. And I think that kind of political consciousness is starting to take hold. I don't know, it has always been there, by the way, but it's starting to take hold in a way that it maybe hasn't before. There's been a lot of global attention to the genocide. There are some unique elements in it. As some people are saying, like, this is the first live streamed genocide, massive destruction in a very small geographical area, relatively speaking, in a very rapid unfolding. The amount of attention it has received at the institutional level, at like the United Nations Criminal Court of Justice, etc., in people's everyday conversations. All that is leading it to becoming, I would say, a political consciousness for a lot of people. Certainly in the Arab world and the Muslim world, but I think beyond as well. And I think it will increasingly become part of the imaginary for what is wrong with this world and what it is that I want to see change in this world. So that makes it, by definition, so it's not diasporic in the sense that you talked about, but it has a global reach in a much more meaningful way than the diasporic identity of being Palestinian, for example. Like I said, I don't want to remove the materiality of what it means to be Palestinian. That's still the ground of everything that I'm talking about. But as it achieves that status of political consciousness, if it remains that way, right? Like that's not something that you can just take for granted that's happening and therefore will happen forever, right? Like, but there's reason to believe that is going to stick in people's minds. Based on just what people say and what people tell you. Like, I'm not the same anymore. So many people are saying that, right? So that gives it a life that it's going to ensure the continuation of resistance to these structures of power, and then it becoming the model for resistance itself. Like I can tell you, for example, I already. Even before the genocide, people would come up to me and say things like, the courage of the Palestinian people is beyond my ability to understand. Like, it inspires me. And I'm talking about people who are engaged in serious struggle that takes a lot of courage themselves, right? So when you hear that, you go, okay, something is happening here, right? Like, there's something here that is going to have effects that are very difficult to predict. So to me, like when I say the path is Palestinian, it is associated with that political consciousness level, not just the experience of Palestinians. So that's on the global scale. Now, in the context of dismantling Israeli settler colonialism, it will be the Palestinian experience that guides it. There's no other way, because that is the experience of the colonized. And again, that has to do more with that than it has to do with anything else. To speak to your other point about soft power, the Zionist movement and the Zionist project and the Israeli state project is quite good at using soft power and brutal power. Now, its ultimate grounding is brute violence. Without that, they can spew all the ideology they want. It doesn't stick if it's not for the material power that makes that stick. I think, for example, many people don't buy into the Zionist talking points, yet do what Zionist organizations would like to see them do. They'll cancel an event, they'll not fund a project, they'll do all those things, even though they will not be in agreement with the Zionist ideology. They'll do them for other reasons, soft power, or not so soft power. So to me, that we have to always keep that in mind, because as important as it is to address the ideological talking points, and I do that a lot in my opinion pieces, in my public commentaries, like in my piece for Mondoweiss in January, I go through the whole talking points around indigeneity, and I address the three main talking points against that. So that's necessary and important work, but it would be naive, as far as I'm concerned, to consider that it's just a narrative battle. The reason their narrative has influence has more to do with their material power, as opposed to the power of their words. We have all the power of the words, but that's all we have. We have no soft power, we have no hard power. There's nothing to gain materially from supporting the Palestinian cause. What you do gain is that you get to speak truth. And you don't have to do any gymnastics to make things fit like they have to. There's freedom and joy in that too. So if you haven't tried it, you can take a shot. No, all good.
I know that I'm speaking for everyone here and for people who join us online, saying thank you for an incredible paper, beautiful book chapter. We need to know when the book will appear, so we'd love to read it and engage with your work. The CHR is looking at the question of partition and non-partition this year, and I think your paper is we're going to travel with it through the year as we grapple. So thank you so much.
That's my honor and pleasure. Thank you all, and I appreciate your engagements and comments. I really do. Thank you all. Yeah. Thank you. No, you know what? I had some, and I left it upstairs, so that's all.
The lift is working now in case you need it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now you're welcome.
I'll tell them. I use that.
We appreciate it.
That's it. I'm going to be carried up.
See you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thinking, having a public experience.
Oh wow, okay, great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks.
That was brilliant.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really